In 1971, a family of four sat down for dinner and vanished before the food even went cold. No signs of a struggle, no goodbye, just an empty table, as if they'd been erased from the world in an instant. For 52 years, no one knew what happened until an old camera was found, and the photos inside revealed something terrifying. Imagine this. A family of four, plates still warm, forks halfway to their mouths, and then nothing. It was the summer of 1971 in the quiet little town of Maple Hollow, the kind of place where everybody knew everybody, where the loudest sound at night was the crickets in the fields and the occasional bark of a neighbor's dog. People left their doors unlocked, and the most scandalous thing that happened was when someone's apple pie went missing from a windowsill. The Millers, James, his wife Ruth, and their two children, 10-year-old Annie and 8-year-old Peter, were the picture-perfect family. James worked at the local hardware store. Ruth was a school librarian, and the kids were well-mannered and bright. They lived in a charming white two-story house at the very edge of town, with a neat little garden in the front and a big oak tree in the back where the kids had built a treehouse. On the evening of August 14th, nothing seemed out of the ordinary. It was a Saturday, and the Millers were having dinner just like they always did. All four gathered at the table in their cozy kitchen. The yellow glow of the ceiling light bathed the room in warmth. A roast chicken sat in the middle of the table, surrounded by bowls of mashed potatoes, peas, and fresh bread. The smell drifted out the open kitchen window into the cool evening air. At 6:15 p.m., their neighbor, Mrs. Dalton, happened to walk by on her way home from the market. She glanced in through that kitchen window, something she often did when passing by, and saw James smiling at her as he carved the chicken. She gave him a friendly wave, and he nodded back. Ruth was laughing at something Annie had said, while Peter was focused on buttering his bread. Everything looked perfectly normal, like a postcard of small-town family life. But by 6:30 p.m., something changed. A phone rang inside the Miller house. Mrs. Dalton, now in her living room next door, could hear it clearly through the open windows. It rang and rang. No one picked up. Strange, she thought, since Ruth always answered on the first or second ring. By 7 p.m., a strange stillness seemed to have settled over the Miller home. No clinking of dishes, no faint hum of conversation, not even the sound of Max, their playful golden retriever, barking at squirrels in the yard. The next morning, Mrs. Dalton noticed the Miller car was still parked in the driveway. The curtains were open. That uneasy feeling in her stomach grew. She decided to check in. When she knocked on the front door, it swung open slowly, unlocked. She stepped inside, calling out, "Ruth? James," but there was no answer. The scene in the dining room made her stop in her tracks. Dinner plates still sat neatly on the table, the chicken half-carved, steam long gone cold. Annie's fork rested halfway across her plate, as if she'd just set it down. Peter's bread sat beside his plate, only half-buttered. Chairs were pushed back slightly, not toppled, just angled as though everyone had stood up mid-bite. Everything else in the house was in perfect order. There were no signs of a struggle, no overturned furniture, no broken glass, no blood. James's wallet sat on the kitchen counter. Ruth's handbag was hanging on the back of her chair. The children's shoes were neatly lined up by the back door. Upstairs, the beds were made. It was as if the Millers had simply gotten up from the table and vanished into thin air. Even stranger, the family dog, Max, was found locked in the laundry room, whining and scratching at the door. Whoever, or whatever, had caused the Millers to disappear had left him behind. Mrs. Dalton ran to call police, but deep down, she knew something about this was wrong. People don't just walk away from a hot meal without a word. People don't just disappear in the middle of dinner. But on that night in 1971, that's exactly what happened. The police arrived within the hour. At first, they treated the situation like a missing persons case. Maybe the Millers had gone on an unexpected trip or been called away for some emergency. But the evidence inside the house told a different story. For starters, their car was still parked in the driveway. The keys were hanging on the hook near the front door. James's wallet, with cash still inside, was on the counter. Ruth's purse contained her ID, lipstick, and a grocery list dated for the next day. The children's school bag sat by the front door, ready for Monday. These were not people planning to be gone for long. Officers carefully inspected the dining room. The food was exactly as Mrs. Dalton had found it, untouched since the moment they'd risen from the table. The roast chicken had dried out, the peas had shriveled, and the mashed potatoes had hardened at the edges. The scene looked frozen in time. One detail caught everyone's attention. The kitchen clock had stopped at exactly 6:22 p.m. The hands were frozen there, as if something had happened at that very moment. But the clock wasn't broken. When police wound it up again, it ticked normally. No one could explain why it had stopped. Even stranger was a single chair at the table that had been turned slightly toward the hallway, away from the table. It was as though someone had suddenly looked up and turned in their seat to face something. The search for the Millers began immediately. Police and volunteers scoured the neighborhood, going door to door, asking if anyone had seen or heard anything unusual. Some neighbors recalled hearing the phone ringing. Others mentioned seeing lights flicker briefly that evening, but no one had seen the family leave. The search expanded into the woods behind the house. Volunteers with flashlights combed through dense trees and underbrush. Dogs were brought in to track their scent. And here's where things became even stranger. The dogs followed a trail from the back door of the Miller home into the yard, but then stopped abruptly about 20 feet from the house, as if the trail just ended in thin air. Divers searched the nearby Maple River, thinking maybe a car had gone in, but found nothing. Flyers with the family's photos were posted all over the county. Roadblocks were set up in and out of town. Yet there were no sightings, no ransom notes, no signs of foul play. Weeks turned into months. Police officers who had worked the case in the beginning admitted privately that they had no leads, not even bad ones. It was as if the Millers had been erased from existence. As the investigation stalled, whispers began to spread through Maple Hollow. People talked about strange occurrences on that stretch of land. Flickering lights, cold spots in the air, voices calling out at night. A few locals brought up old stories, ones most people had laughed off. Tales of people going missing near the Miller property decades earlier. By 1973, the case had gone cold. The Miller home was sold to a young couple from out of town. But they didn't stay long. Within 6 months, they moved out, claiming they heard footsteps in the kitchen at night, chairs scraping across the floor, and, most disturbing, a woman's voice softly saying, "Dinner's ready," when no one else was in the house. The house changed owners several more times over the years, but no one stayed for long. And for over 5 decades, the question remained unanswered. What happened to the Millers at 6:22 p.m. on that summer night? 52 years passed. The disappearance of the Millers had become a ghost story in Maple Hollow, a tale older residents whispered about to newcomers, and teenagers dared each other to talk about on dark nights. The house itself had been abandoned for years now, its paint peeling, windows clouded with dust, the once vibrant garden choked with weeds. Most people avoided it. But then, in the spring of 2023, something unexpected surfaced, not in the house itself, but at an estate sale 2 towns over. A man named Tom Hargrove, a 38-year-old mechanic with a love for vintage collectibles, had been browsing tables of old tools, records, and knickknacks. Among the piles of junk, he noticed a small leather case. Inside was a dusty Polaroid land camera from the late 60s. It was scuffed and worn, the strap fraying, but the real surprise was what Tom found inside, a cartridge of undeveloped film, still sealed in the camera after all these decades. Tom didn't recognize the seller, and when he asked about the camera, the man just shrugged and said it came from a box of belongings left in an old storage unit. There was no mention of the Millers, no connection, or so it seemed. Curious, Tom bought it for $5 and took it home. Being a hobby photographer, he decided to see if anything could be salvaged from the ancient roll of film. It was a long shot. Film that old usually came back as nothing but blurs and discoloration. Still, Tom brought it to a specialist who dealt with vintage film restoration. A week later, the results came in. The first few images were harmless. Birthday parties, fishing trips, backyard barbecues. They looked like they belonged to an ordinary small-town family in the late 60s or early 70s. But then came the last 3 photos, and Tom's hands shook as he looked at them. The first of the 3 showed the Miller family at their dining table. The same dining table now collecting dust in the abandoned house. James was smiling, carving the roast chicken. Ruth's eyes sparkled. Annie and Peter were leaning toward each other, mid-laughter. In the corner of the image, the yellow kitchen light glowed warmly. The date printed along the bottom edge read, August 14th, 1971, the very night they vanished. The next photo seemed to have been taken only seconds later, but the atmosphere had changed. All four Millers were now looking toward the hallway to the left of the frame. James's hand hovered midair, knife paused above the chicken. Ruth's smile had faded. Annie's fork was frozen inches from her mouth. Peter's eyes looked wide, as if startled. Something, or someone, had drawn their attention away from the camera. And then came the third photo. The chairs were empty. The plates and food were still there, but the family was gone, in their place. The background seemed strangely warped, as if the air itself had bent and twisted. And in the shadowed hallway, barely in focus, a tall, dark figure stood. It was leaning slightly toward the camera, its head tilted in an unnatural angle. The face, if it could be called that, was pale and distorted, with eyes too dark to be human. Tom stared at the photo for hours. How had this camera ended up miles away, at an unrelated estate sale? Who had taken the pictures? And, most importantly, what had happened in the seconds between that second and third shot? He didn't know it yet, but finding that old camera was the start of something he would wish he'd never uncovered. Tom couldn't get the photos out of his head. He studied them late into the night, zooming in, adjusting the light, searching for details. Every time his eyes landed on that third image, the empty chairs and that shadowy figure in the hallway, a cold shiver crept up his spine. The date printed on the bottom of the photo kept burning in his mind, August 14th, 1971, the night the Millers disappeared. Eventually, curiosity overpowered fear. Tom decided he needed to see the place for himself. It was late afternoon when he parked his truck at the edge of the overgrown driveway. The Miller house looked even worse in person. Shingles missing, windows clouded with grime, ivy crawling up the sides like green veins. The air was still, unnaturally still, as if the world around the property had paused. Tom pushed open the creaking front door, which swung inward with a groan. The smell hit him first, a stale mix of dust, rotting wood, and something faintly metallic. Sunlight streamed weakly through the dirty windows, casting long shadows across the warped wooden floor. The house was silent, except for the sound of his own breathing. He made his way down the hallway, every step on the loose boards sounding too loud in the quiet. At the end of the hall was the kitchen and dining room, exactly where the photos had been taken. The table was still there, not the same plates or food, of course, but the table itself, scratched, faded, and warped from years of neglect. One of the chairs was slightly turned toward the hallway, just like in the second photo. Tom reached into his bag and pulled out the Polaroid camera. He set it on the table, just to take a picture of where it had all happened. That's when he heard it. A faint click. Tom froze. His hands hadn't touched the shutter. The sound had come from the camera itself, as if it had taken a photo on its own. Heart pounding, he reached for the developing picture as it slid out. Slowly, the pale shapes began to form. It was the dining room, the table, the same angle he was looking at now. But in the photo, the table wasn't empty. The Millers were sitting there, exactly as they had been in 1971. James's knife hovered above the roast. Ruth's hands rested on the table. Annie and Peter looked mid-laugh, but something was different. Their skin was pale, almost gray. Their eyes were completely black, like pools of ink, and all four of them were staring directly at the camera. The air in the room seemed to grow heavier. Tom felt something cold slide across the back of his neck, the sensation of being watched. He didn't wait to find out what might happen next. Dropping the photo onto the dusty floor, he turned and bolted down the hallway, the sound of his own footsteps echoing behind him, except there was another set, faint but steady, following just a few paces behind. He didn't stop running until he was in his truck, engine roaring, speeding away from the house. Tom didn't sleep that night. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw those pale faces, those black, empty eyes staring into him through the Polaroid. The memory of those footsteps trailing behind him refused to fade. The next morning, he took the camera and the photos to the local police. At first, they didn't take him seriously until they looked at the images. An officer took him into the back, and within an hour, a detective returned with a pale, uneasy expression. The photos were sent to an imaging specialist in the city. Weeks later, the report came back. The film was authentic, the images untouched. No evidence of tampering, no signs of double exposure or editing. The only unusual finding was that the chemical composition of the film was unstable, as if it had been exposed to something outside normal environmental conditions. But the bigger shock came from the historical records. Local historians, stirred by Tom's discovery, dug into the land's past. Long before the Miller house was built, the property belonged to a man named Silas Harrow, a reclusive figure from the late 1800s. Harrow was known for his obsession with death and the afterlife. Some claimed he practiced occult rituals, attempting to trap souls in a place between worlds so they could never move on. Over the decades, there have been whispers, travelers disappearing near property line, strange lights in the woods, voices calling from nowhere. No one had connected these stories to the Miller case until now. One theory began to take shape. The Millers had not been taken away from the house that night. They had been taken into it, or rather, into whatever existed through it. The old camera may have been more than a device for capturing moments. It might have been the key to glimpsing that other place, the one where the Millers had been trapped for 52 years. If that was true, then Tom's visit may have done something even worse. He hadn't just seen them. They had seen him. Tom began noticing strange things in the weeks after his visit. Lights flickering in his home, the faint smell of roast chicken in his kitchen late at night, and once, while passing a mirror, the reflection of a young boy sitting at his dining table, staring at him with black, bottomless eyes. The Miller house remains abandoned to this day, rotting quietly at the edge of Maple Hollow. Locals claim that if you walk past after dark, you can see shapes sitting at the dining table